Okay, so our last lesson, we learned about using Punnett squares to predict the probability um, of traits showing up in offspring when we know what the parents' traits are. And remember, traits are determined by genes, and a gene is a segment of DNA, and you always get two versions of every gene because you have two parents. So you get one version from your male parent and one version from your female parent. And sometimes you inherit the same version. And just to remind you of what version means, a different version of a gene, the word that we're going to use is called allele. So sometimes you inherit two of the same alleles. So like if both your mom and your dad have blue eyes, then you're going to inherit two of the same alleles. But sometimes you inherit two different versions of the gene or two different alleles, and that's called heterozygous. And that would be like if your mom had brown eyes and your dad had blue eyes or something like that. Or all kinds of different traits. You know, you always get two different versions. And so we use Punnett squares to predict the probability of what traits the offspring will have. Well, sometimes we as scientists want to look at a trait as it travels through a family. So we know that genes are passed on from parents to offspring. And so, and some genes cause problems, cause diseases and disorders. And so a lot of times parents want to get genetic counseling before they have children because they know that there's some kind of disorder or disease that runs in their family. And they want to know, what are the chances that our child will end up with this particular gene that causes this disease? And so when that is the case, scientists use something called pedigrees. And so let me show you what a pedigree looks like. Share my screen here with you. That's not it. There it is right here. Nope, that's not it. Sorry, let me hide this and find what I need. And that's not it. Here it is. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so this is what a pedigree looks like. And it kind of looks like a family tree, but its purpose is to track a particular gene that runs in a family. And usually it's some kind of disease or disorder that it is used to track. Okay, so when you look at a pedigree, you see some shapes here, you see some lines. So let's talk about what all those different shapes and lines and shaded and unshaded, what do all those things mean? So on a pedigree, a circle represents a female. So this is a female, this is a female, these are females, okay? And squares represent males. So this is a male, this is a male, 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 okay? Now a horizontal line on a pedigree means that the male and the female are a couple, probably married, and there's the possibility that they could have children. So this is the horizontal line. So these two could have children, these two could have children, these two, okay, like that. So the horizontal line connects the middle of the shape, okay? A vertical line coming down are the children of the couple, okay? So this vertical line coming down, and so this is their son, and then they have two daughters here. And so you see how this line, this horizontal line connects these three, but they're not a couple because the horizontal line comes out of the top here. Okay, so they are siblings. And this vertical line goes up to their parents who are connected by a horizontal line that goes through the middle, attaches them in the middle. Okay, so normally you'll have Roman numerals out here representing the generations. This one doesn't have it, but one that we'll look at later does have the Roman numerals. But we have 3 generations here. So this is the first generation, second generation, and third generation. So if the circle or the square is shaded in dark, then that means that those individuals are affected. That means whatever the trait is, whatever the gene is that they are tracking through the family, they are affected by it. And then so the unshaded, so the ones that are just white, are not affected by the trait. Okay, so that's the basics. There are 3 types of pedigrees that we might look at. One of them represents an autosomal recessive trait or gene. The other one is an autosomal dominant gene. And then the final one is a sex-linked recessive, or also called an X-linked. So what does that mean, X-linked, and what does autosomal mean? You know what recessive and dominant means from the previous video on Punnett squares, but what is that autosomal business? So in humans, we have 46 chromosomes. We have 44 autosomal chromosomes. Those are just the normal chromosomes, just regular old chromosomes, autosomal. And then we have 2 sex chromosomes. And so a total of 46 chromosomes, but 2 of them are our sex chromosomes. And if you receive 2 X chromosomes, an X from your mom and an X from your dad, then you will be female. If you receive an X and a Y, an X from your mom and a Y from your dad, then you will be male. So you have 2 sex chromosomes. And so when we're talking about a gene that is X-linked, then that means it is on your X chromosome. Okay. If we say it's autosomal, then that means it's on one of your 44 other chromosomes. Okay. So how do we tell, if we see a pedigree, how can we tell what type of pedigree or what type of trait we're looking at, what type of gene? Is it an autosomal gene on one of our regular 44 chromosomes, or is it an X-linked gene on one of our 2 sex chromosomes? And if it's autosomal, is it a recessive gene or is it a dominant gene? And so there are a few little clues that we need to remember. If it is autosomal recessive, then that means males and females are equally likely to inherit this trait. Often it skips a generation, but not always, but often it does. And a child may inherit, I'm doing a video. Oh, okay. A child may inherit the disease even though neither parent has this disease. So there's a key question that you need to remember when you're looking at a pedigree. So you look at the pedigree and you ask yourself this question. So is there anywhere on this pedigree where I see that a child is affected by the trait, but if I look at their parents, so if I go up that vertical line and look at their parents, neither of their parents is affected. So if you see that anywhere, the child is affected, but neither parent is affected, then you know it is an autosomal recessive trait. Examples of autosomal recessive genes that cause diseases are cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and Tay-Sachs. Okay, the other type of autosomal gene is an autosomal dominant gene. Again, males and females are equally likely to inherit this disease. And in this case, there are no carriers. And so let me explain what carrier means. You remember we learned the term heterozygous. So when you're heterozygous, you have a dominant and a recessive. So if you are heterozygous for a recessive, an autosomal recessive trait, then that means you're a carrier. So you have the dominant gene. So that means you don't have whatever this recessive trait is. Cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia. You don't have it because you have the dominant gene, and the dominant gene, remember, covers up the recessive gene. But since you're heterozygous, you are a carrier of that recessive gene. So you can pass that gene on to your children. Okay, so that's why it's important to figure out who the carriers of these autosomal recessive genes are that cause diseases. And that's what we use pedigrees for. But with an autosomal dominant gene, this keeps jumping around. With an autosomal dominant gene, there's no carriers because it's dominant. So carriers are only carriers of a recessive gene. If it's a dominant gene, then whether you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you're going to have it because it's dominant. So when you're looking at a pedigree and you're trying to determine if it's autosomal dominant, you ask this question: does every affected individual have at least one affected parent? So remember, for the recessive, the question is are there any affected children where neither parent has it? If the answer to that is yes, then it's recessive. But if you look at the pedigree and every affected individual has at least one affected parent, then you know it's dominant. And so an example of a dominant gene that causes a disorder is for Huntington's disease. Now, the last type of pedigree is the X-linked recessive. And remember, this means if it's X-linked, that means it's on one of your two sex chromosomes. So it's on the X chromosome. That's why we call it X-linked. And so if you are a male, you only have one X chromosome. So if you have a gene on that one X chromosome, then whatever that gene is, you're going to exhibit that trait. Okay, so if it happens to be a disorder, then you're going to have it. So males are much more likely to have X-linked diseases and disorders than females, because females have two X chromosomes. And so if they inherit one defective gene on one of their X chromosomes, then the chances are pretty good, it's a 50-50 deal, that their other X chromosome will not have the defective gene. And so in that case, it would cover up the defective gene. So females are not as likely to get these. Males are affected more often than females. Affected fathers do not pass on to their son, because remember, it's on the X chromosome. And if the father is affected, they don't give their son an X chromosome. They only give their son a Y chromosome. And mothers tend to be the carriers for this trait. The mothers don't necessarily have the trait, but they are often the carriers because it's recessive. So they can have the dominant gene and not have the trait or not have the disorder, but they're carriers of that recessive gene that causes the disorder. So the way you determine if a pedigree is showing an X-linked trait or disorder, you look at the pedigree and you ask yourself, are mostly or all males affected by this trait? So you look at it and you're like, none of the females are affected. So that means it's X-linked. Okay, so examples of X-linked genes that cause problems, that cause disorders, the gene that causes DMD, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and color blindness. And you'll see that color blindness is much more common in males than in females. And that's because it's carried on that X chromosome. And males only have one X chromosome. So if there's something wrong on that one X chromosome, then they're going to have it. Okay, so let's do a little practice. let's answer just a few basic questions about this pedigree. So how many generations are shown in this pedigree? So remember I told you the Roman numerals over here on the side tell you how many generations. And so we see we've got 1, 2, 3 generations. Okay, and then how many females? So remember, females are the circles. So let's count the circles. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 females. And then the males are the squares. So let's count the squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 males. And then how many members of the family are afflicted with Huntington's disease? So that means how many are affected by Huntington's disease? So we're going to count the number of shaded shapes. So this male is affected. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 family members that are affected. And so all of the shaded in circles and squares are affected. Now, there are no carriers for Huntington's disease. You either have it or you don't. So with this in mind, is Huntington's disease caused by a dominant or a recessive trait? Well, let's look at our pedigree and ask ourselves the questions. First of all, let's eliminate whether it's X-linked. So when I look at this pedigree, I see that there are 2 males that are affected, and there are 3 females, 1, 2, 3. So it's not all males or mostly males. In fact, it's pretty even. So we know it's not X-linked. So now let's look, does every affected, the question we have to ask ourselves for the dominant is, does every affected individual have at least one affected parent? And so let's go to each of the affected individuals. So here's, this one is affected and her mom is affected. Okay. And then we have 3 affected individuals here in generation 2, and their dad is affected. So the answer to my question is yes, every affected person has at least one affected parent. So I'm thinking it's going to be autosomal dominant. Let me ask that last question about autosomal recessive. So autosomal recessive says, is there anywhere where a child is affected, but neither parent is affected? And we pretty much already answered that because we see that this child is affected and their mom is affected. And these 3 are affected and their dad is affected. So the answer to that is no. So we know that this is autosomal dominant. It's pedigree that we're looking at. Okay, the next question says, how many children did individual 1, 1 and 1, 2 have? So the first, it's the 1, Roman numeral 1 means that it's in this row, generation 1. And then it says 1, 1 and 1, 2. So this is generation 1, and this is person 1, 1, and this is person 1, 2. So how many children did they have? So we look at this vertical line going down, and we want to look at the individuals that are connected to this the vertical line and this horizontal line. So I see this person is connected, and this person is connected. This one is connected, but now this one is not connected. So we can't count that one. This one's connected, this one, and this one. So that's a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they had 6 children. Okay. And then how many girls did 2, 1 and 2, 2 have? So now we're looking at generation 2. So 2, 1 is right here and 2, 2 is right here. So how many girls did they have? Well, they have 2 circles connected down to them. So they had 2 girls, and one of the girls is affected with Huntington's disease. So how many girls did they have? They had 2 girls. And how many had Huntington's disease? Just 1. Okay. All right. So now let's practice a little bit more of determining. This is called determining the inheritance pattern. So the inheritance pattern is one of 3 choices for our reasons. There's other inheritance patterns, but we are only going to look at 3. So is it autosomal dominant? Is it autosomal recessive? Or is it X-linked? Okay. So here's the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Are there any affected children with both parents unaffected? If yes, it's autosomal recessive. Okay. But we also need to check on question number 3 before we determine for sure. Question number 3 says, does the trait affect mostly males? If the answer is yes, then that means it's X-linked. Okay, but it's also recessive, but it's X-linked as well. If our answer to number 1 is no, then we go to number 2. And number 2 says, does every affected child have at least one affected parent? If the answer is yes, it's autosomal dominant. Okay, so let's look at these 3 pedigrees and run through our questions and determine which inheritance pattern they have. So this first one, I see that I have 3 affected individuals. So I'm going to ask my question, are there any affected children with both parents unaffected? So yes, I see this male child is affected and neither parent is affected. I also see this over here. This male child is affected and neither parent is affected. And then again here, this male child is affected and neither of his parents are affected. So that means it is recessive, but before I can say it's autosomal recessive, I need to check on question number 3. So question number 3 says, does the trait affect mostly males? And yes, I have 3 males affected. No females are affected. So that means that this first one is X-linked, okay? And it's recessive, but it's X-linked recessive. So for my first pedigree, the type of pedigree is X-linked recessive. And my evidence is that only males are affected. Okay, now let's look at this next one. So this next one, I'm going to ask my first question. Are there any affected children with both parents unaffected? So here I see that there is a male that is affected and neither of his parents are affected. So my answer to this question is yes. So now I need to check on number 3. Does the trait affect mostly males? Well, I've got a male affected and a female affected, so it's 50-50. And so that means it is not X-linked. So it is autosomal recessive. So pedigree number 2 is autosomal recessive. And my evidence is affected children with both parents unaffected. Okay. Now let's look at number 3. Number 3 here, I'm going to ask my first question. Are there any affected children with both parents unaffected? So I'm going to take each person that is affected. So right here in generation 3, person 5, they are affected and their mom is affected. Also in generation 3, persons 3 and 4 are affected and their dad is affected. Now go up to generation 2, person number 3 is affected and his mom is affected. Person number 5 is affected and her mom is affected. So the answer to this one is no. So I go to number 2. The question is, does every affected child have at least one affected parent? Yes. So that means this pedigree represents an autosomal dominant trait, and my evidence is all affected individuals have at least, oh my goodness, can't type. One affected parent. Okay. So that's how you determine, that's how you read a pedigree and how you determine the inheritance pattern of a pedigree. So our next video, we're going to do a little more practice. We're going to look at some actual case studies with genetic disorders and see how pedigrees are actually used to help people determine, you know, what is the likelihood that if a trait is, if a gene is running in their family and that gene is for some type of disease, what are the chances that if they have a child, that that child will have that disease? Okay, thank you for your attention.